Hello, and welcome to the eighth in a series of 12 lessons from the book of Job, presented by the British Bible School. From chapters 15 to 21 of Job, we read the second cycle of speeches. In the first cycle, Eliphaz had emphasized the moral perfection of God, Bildad his unwavering justice, and Zophar his omniscience, his all-powerfulness. Since this did not bring the expected response from Job, the friends see him as a menace to true religion, so they intensify their approach against him. Job's guilt grows greater, says Eliphaz in chapter 15. It is his sin that's leading him to such outrageous thoughts. In this particular speech, Eliphaz is no longer considerate and rebukes Job for his arrogance and warns about the judgment the wicked bring upon themselves. We read in the first 6 verses of Job 15, Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, Should a wise man answer with windy knowledge, and fill his belly with the east wind? Should he argue in unprofitable talk, or in words with which he can do no good? But you are doing away with the fear of God, and hindering meditation before God. For your iniquity teaches your mouth, and you choose the tongue of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, and not I. Your own lips testify against you. In this speech, Eliphaz we see is no longer considerate and rebukes Job for his arrogance and warns him about the judgment the wicked bring upon themselves. He alleges Job's guilt. He calls Job's words vain and windy, again saying they are hollow and to no advantage. More than that, he thinks they are damaging in that they destroy a fear of God. They corrupt meditation and prayer. He carries on in verse 7. Are you the first man who was born, or were you brought forth before the hills? Have you listened in the counsel of God, and do you limit wisdom to yourself? What do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that is not clear to us? Both the grey-haired and the aged are among us, older than your father. Are the comforts of God too small for you, or the word that deals gently with you? Why does your heart carry you away, and why do your eyes flash, that you turn your spirit against God, and bring such words out of your mouth? Being the first man, born even before the hills, you're obviously older and wiser than the rest of us. Eliphaz says Job speaks as though he even sat in the council with God as an eternal witness. He continues, What is man that he can be pure, or he who is born of a woman that he can be righteous? Behold, God puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight. How much less one who is abominable and corrupt, a man who drinks injustice like water. He speaks as though Job had claimed to be sinless. However, Job only maintains innocence of a great sin which caused this great suffering. He is a sinner, but he hasn't, according to their theology, sinned in such a great way that he should suffer in such a terrible way. Eliphaz turns to the wisdom of the fathers. It seems that a revelation that he had made no impact on Job. So he goes on to say, I will show you, hear me, and what I have seen I will declare, what wise men have told without hiding it from their fathers, to whom alone the land was given, and no stranger passed among them. Eliphaz wants to get the point across that you seem to think you're older and wiser than us, so he leaves his revelation, and now he'll give him the opinion of the fathers who are older than his own father, which he believes will stand in judgment of Job. From verses 20 to 28, Eliphaz gives 7 wicked man's troubles. He writhes in pain The same Hebrew word here describes labour pains. He writhes in this kind of pain all of his life. He dies earlier than the godly do. He has irrational fears. He suffers destruction while at peace. He experiences torment by a guilty conscience. He feels he is a hunted person. He is anxious about his basic needs, and he feels distressed and in anguish. These are things that Eliphaz mentions, but also mentions previously in chapter 14, but also some of the circumstances we see written of in chapter 1, with Job suffering them. So Job had confessed every one of these troubles, but Eliphaz was implying that Job had all these marks of a wicked man. Now, is that enough? Of course not. Let's add 7 more troubles to really get the point home to Job. The wicked person will not prosper, but will die. His works will fail, and he deceives himself. He will suffer prematurely. His wealth will fail. He will experience barrenness. Note that Eliphaz began this section with a reference to childbirth in verse 20, and he ended it with another reference to the same thing in verse 35. Not all these judgments are completely distinct from one another. The poetic way in which he is speaking offers what's called parallelism, often uses a slight restatement to make a more forceful impression rather than to express a different idea. It's a different way of saying the same thing. He's really hammering the point home to Job. So now, of course, Job has got to reply to this and has got to speak for a 5th time. Instead of comforting Job, his friends have hurt him with their speeches. Indeed, they are miserable comforters. Job rejects all the theories they've presented, as they've all presented nothing but the theory of retribution. Job will go on to say to them, if you were in my condition, I could speak the same way, but I wouldn't do it. You are the miserable comforters. So Job says, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Shall windy words have an end? Or what provokes you that you answer? I also could speak as you do, if you were in my place. I could join words together against you, and shake my head at you. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips would assuage your pain. If I speak, my pain is not assuaged, and if I forbear, how much of it leaves me? Job believes God is punishing him for some sin he is not aware of. The only difference with his friends are they think he knows what he's done, and he's just not admitting it. But I wouldn't speak to you this way. I would try and comfort you. I would try and strengthen you, he says, to embrace you, to assuage your grief. But you, my friends, have brought me no comfort. It goes on to say, God has worn me out. He has shriveled me up, which is a witness against me. He has torn me in his wrath and hated me. He has gnashed his teeth at me. Men have struck me insolently on the cheek. They mass themselves together against me. God gives me up to the ungodly and casts me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease and he broke me apart. He seized me by the neck and dashed me to pieces. He set me up as his target. His archers surround me. He slashes open my kidneys and does not spare. He pours out my gall on the ground. My face is red with weeping, and on my eyelids is deep darkness, although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. With all this that's happening to him, Job cries out for an advocate in heaven. O earth, cover not my blood, and let my cry find no resting place. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high. My friends scorn me. My eye pours out tears to God, that he would argue the case of a man with God, as a son of man does with his neighbour. For when a few years have come, I shall go the way from which I shall not return. My spirit is broken. My days are extinct. The graveyard is ready for me. Surely there are mockers about me, and my eye dwells on their provocation. Job knew he was innocent, but he couldn't prove it. His friends wouldn't speak for him. God, it seemed, was not listening to him. He wanted someone to speak on his behalf. There's nothing to suggest he had some special revelation about Jesus, but Jesus ultimately is the witness, the advocate for him and for us before God. Job was not sinless. He never claimed to be. He did what was needed to cover his sin. He feared he was not holy or righteous, so offered the sacrifices needed to cover his sin. But somehow he felt it wasn't enough. And as for us, our fear is that we are sinners. We are not holy. We are not righteous. As Job needed an advocate, a witness in heaven, so do we, whose righteousness and holiness can make up for our shortcomings. In Genesis chapter 4 and verse 10, we read of this idea of an innocent person's blood crying out from the ground for justice. Job did not want the earth to cover his blood either, so that it could cry out for his name to be cleared, even if he was not alive to see his justification. Because Job's friends were not pleading his case, someone needed to speak to God on his behalf. Well, of course, when we get to Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 24, we find out who that person is. For Christ has entered, not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now, to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Going into chapter 17, he begins to speak about the grave again. Well, he actually speaks of the grave again just prior to this in the closing verses of chapter 16. But he seems to be looking to the grave to get his relief. My spirit is broken. My days are extinct. The graveyard is ready for me. Surely there are mockers about me, and my eye dwells on their provocation. Lay down a pledge for me with yourself. Who is there who will put up security for me? Since you have closed their hearts to understanding, therefore you will not let them triumph. He who informs against his friends to get a share of their property, the eyes of his children will fail. He's crying out for a fair and honest trial. He has cried for his salvation, for his witness, but he loses sight of anything but the grave. Now, as was mentioned, a pledge should be offered, and in legal cases, each litigant would give the judge a pledge, a guarantee, of money or some personal possession before the trial. This bond would guarantee that the litigant would be fair and honest. If one of the litigants was not honest, the judge would not return his bond at the end of the trial. Job called on God to lay down his pledge, as the prosecutor, with himself, the judge. The guarantor was one who provided the bond if the person on trial could not. Job's friends would normally provide his bond, but they turned against him. Some suggest because of the way he's writing, it's because they want a share of his property when he's gone. Job laid the ultimate responsibility for his friends' blindness and rejection at God's feet, because God had withheld understanding from them. He ends the speech talking again of death. Where's my hope? Can anyone find it? No. He will go with me to the grave, because no one left after him will plead his case, or at least he doesn't believe someone will plead his case. So then Bildad has heard all this, and he now wants to come in and let Job know for certain that suffering is a punishment from God. And if he's suffering, it's God who must be doing it. He's a righteous judge, so he's correct in doing it against you. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered and said, How long will you hunt for words? Consider, and then we will speak. Why are we counted as cattle? Why are we stupid in your sight? You who tear yourself in your anger. Shall the earth be forsaken for you, or the rock be removed out of its place? Bildad's angry because Job continues to speak. He should have quietened down when he'd been told by his friends what he needed to do, but there's no end to his words. He feels offended by Job, who has ridiculed the wisdom of his friends, decrying them as ignorant. Bildad holds Job to be arrogant, because Job rejected the theory of retribution which his friends applied to him. Job has spoken as though that theory could be changed. Bildad says, Sooner shall the earth be unpopulated and the rocks removed than that this old theory be changed. In his speech, he says a lot of things that agree with Eliphaz. We'll notice from Eliphaz's speech in chapter 15, Bildad mirrors a lot of what is said in chapter 18. Concerning the wicked, they both say, the wicked will experience darkness. They are like unhealthy plants. They are destroyed by fire. They lose their influence. They are terrified by anguish. They lose their homes. They oppose or do not know God. They are ensnared. How many of these things apply directly to Job? When they're talking about the wicked person as though it's some other person somewhere, how much of this does Job recognize is being directed at him? Not once, but twice, by both of them in their speeches. Bildad also gives 4 pictures of the death of the wicked. They are a light put out, a traveller trapped, a criminal pursued, and a tree rooted up. In the last 2 verses of the chapter, he says, They of the west are appalled at his day, and horror seizes them of the east. Surely such are the dwellings of the unrighteous, such is the place of him who knows not God. Put all these things together, people will come and see, hear the stories of what happened to this person, see the destruction that's left behind, and they can only come to the conclusion, this was the home of a wicked person. He's talking about the wicked person, but he's describing Job's situation. Job talks about leaving this earth, dying and going on and being away from it, and having an advocate who will speak up on his behalf. Now Bildad's turning around and saying, people will come and look at this. They'll make their own conclusion. They'll know a wicked person lived here. There's lessons for us, of course, about how we behave towards those who are suffering. Do we have some idea in our mind that they're suffering because of something that they've done wrong? Indeed, there are consequences of sin that cause people to suffer. What's our attitude towards them? Are we going to want to get people to agree with our theology? Or can we sympathise with them and try and get them to think about God, which is often one of the things that results from people suffering? Maybe they took part in some activity. Maybe they have abused themselves in some way that has led them now to be suffering. Do we turn round and say, well, that's judgment on you, that's your own fault? Or do we, rather than being like Job's friends, try to understand how this came about, what led to it, and what can they do from now? You see, Job's friends failed to give him credit for his desire to come to terms with God. It sounded like he was arguing against God. All he was doing is saying, I can't understand this. What's happening? So Job has to reply to Bildad. This will be his 6th speech in chapter 19. And basically it tells him, you make my suffering worse. In chapter 19, Job describes himself in these ways: as an animal that's trapped, a criminal in court, a traveller who is fenced in, a king dethroned, a structure destroyed, a tree uprooted, and a city besieged. Sounds a lot like what we've already heard from his friends. Job answered and said, "How long will you torment me and break me in pieces with words? These 10 times you have cast reproach upon me. Are you not ashamed to wrong me? And even if it be true that I have erred, my error remains with myself. If indeed you magnify yourselves against me, and make my disgrace an argument against me, know then that God has put me in the wrong, and closed his net about me." It repeats how they grieve him. In fact, they've tried to demolish him. They bring him no comfort, only grief. So he rebukes them for meddling. Job holds that even if he were guilty, it would be none of their business. So why don't they just leave him alone? Once more, Job gives his view of the case. No matter how his friends accuse him, Job maintains his integrity. Indeed, God has surrounded him with calamities, but there's no cause, as far as Job can see. In verse 8 he continues, "He has walled up my way so that I cannot pass, and he has set darkness upon my paths. He has stripped from me my glory, and taken the crown from my head. He breaks me down on every side, and I am gone, and my hope has he pulled up like a tree. He has kindled his wrath against me, and counts me as his adversary. His troops come on together. They have cast up their siege ramp against me, and encamp around my tent." He was simply describing God as he perceived him to be. He couldn't understand why God was apparently treating him unjustly, and he repeatedly asked God to solve this mystery for him. God lets him cry in vain. Job calls and calls for God, but God, it seems, doesn't hear. God has torn him all around. His honour is gone, his crown is taken away, his branches are broken off. God, it seems, is treating Job as an enemy, allowing an army to run against him. From verses 13 to 24, he says this as a list, so we can get the impact of it. "My relatives have failed me. My close friends have forgotten me. The guests in my house and my maidservants count me as a stranger. I call to my servant, but he gives me no answer. My breath is strange to my wife. Even young children despise me. All my intimate friends abhor me. Those whom I loved have turned against me. Have mercy on me. Have mercy on me, O you my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Why do you, like God, pursue me? Why are you not satisfied with my flesh?" Do you avoid people that you think have become involved in something wrong or that you disagree with? Job is crying out for a testimony concerning him, a true testimony. He begs for pity, for compassion from his friends, but they would rather condemn him than comfort him. They persecute him like a wild animal. So Job looks elsewhere for testimony. It is his desire that his integrity be written in a book, engraved on a rock, and chiselled, with a groove to be filled with lead. Little did Job know that it would be written in a book that we would be reading in 2020. The Bible. That's much better than having it written in stone. He makes a threefold confession in verses 25 to 27. First of all, there's a confession of faith. I know. Well, how does he know? Has his condition changed? Not at all. It's got worse. What does he know then? That my Redeemer. He speaks of his Redeemer. His Redeemer will plead his case after his death. In our context, Job is thinking neither of healing nor of resurrection. The King James Version and the Revised Standard Version text might suggest he's concerned with the clearing of his good name, and so vindicator expresses the sense of what he's trying to say best. Job, who is not a member of the chosen people and who does not stand in a covenant relationship to God, discovers through his suffering that he has been so bound up with God that he can turn to him and call on him for vindication as a right. I've been serving you. I've been doing all the things I ought to do as someone who is following you. You need to vindicate me. This is a turning point in Job's words. There's a climax here, but it's not the climax. He knows that my Redeemer lives. Job expects to die. Then his blood will lie upon the earth, and he knows his blood will be avenged. He doesn't want his blood to be covered up. He wants it to cry out for justice, and his cause will be pleaded upon the earth. His name will be kept alive. Then there's a confession of hope. Job expects to die. There are many symptoms of the approach of death. Germs destroy both his skin and the little flesh that is left. The germs will seem to be victorious over Job's body, because he will die from this, he believes. But actually, Job's Redeemer will stand in later days on the earth. The germs are not the end. The Redeemer will be victorious and will be the conqueror. Job even expects to see God from his flesh after his death. He says, my eyes shall see it. And stranger, as in the case of an avenger of blood, a stranger would see the avenging. Job won't be alive to see it. But better than that, his eyes will see God. He then gives a confession of love. My heart is consumed within me. The heart is the seat of the affections. Job says his heart is longing for the Redeemer. From the depths of his being, he is consumed with longing for love for him, and he will see him. He goes on to give a warning to his friends after this. His friends have persecuted him because they think that they have found the root of his sufferings, that it's in his own sinful nature. So Job warns his friends about the results of such false accusations. They will be held to account and they will be punished for it. And yet the strange thing is, the ironic thing is, the root of the matter does lie in Job himself. It's after all because of Job's piety, his holiness, his wanting to serve God, his faithfulness to God that he's been afflicted. In other words, this is his fault. But it's for the opposite reason to what his friends believe. Well, Job has spoken, and so Zophar now thinks he needs to come in and lend a hand. Truth is more important than friendship, is his basic point. And they must point out his sin. They must point out that all nature conspires against you, Job. This is a passionate but impetuous talk. He says, first of all, that he is forced to speak. Haste can be responsible for an incorrect view of man. In Psalm 116 and verse 11, the question is asked or said, statement is made, all mankind are liars. Well, are all mankind liars? Probably not. What about a person of a particular nationality or a couple of people of a particular nationality that get a name for something? Do we say all people of that nationality are like that? Is that true? That's something that's spoken in haste. It's not really been thought about. And Zophar is doing this here. This also leads haste to an incorrect or partial view of God. His haste explains his theology. Had he taken time to observe and reflect, he would have said, actually, some sufferers are saints. Some sufferers are faithful to God. Had he taken still more time, he might have said, some sufferers are saviours. because we in fact know this. We know a sufferer who, with their theology, would be considered wicked, but he was actually the Saviour of the world. The wickedness that he took upon himself was our wickedness, our sin, not his own. So their reasoning is all wrong. Suffering Job appears in a false light as sinning Job. You're suffering because you've sinned. The false light on mankind comes from a distorted view of God. Your view, your opinion of our beginnings will govern the way you think about people and humanity. And the way you think about God will govern the way you think about humanity. There is nothing in Zophar's words to suggest that God is anything more than an impatient judge. Here's a short summary of Zophar's speech. The life of the wicked is brief. Their pleasure is temporary. I love the verse that says it tastes good on the tongue, but when it's in the stomach, it makes them feel sick. Their death is painful. He's preaching a buy now, pay now attitude towards sin. If you sin now, you'll suffer now for what you've done. Job should expect God to reveal his sinfulness and for the earth to rise up as a witness against him. Rather than wait for some vindication on the earth, this is what's going to happen. Well, was Zophar correct in his assessment of the wicked person's fate? He was certainly correct in saying that God judges sin. He was wrong in claiming that God's judgment always takes place during our earthly lifetime. We read that the life of the wicked is brief, well, so is everyone's. We're a mist. We do know that pleasure is temporary, and death can be painful, not just physically, emotionally. It is a painful thing, but that applies to everyone. You see, Zophar was also inaccurate in saying that Job was the type of person that he's describing, because he wasn't. So Job has to reply to Zophar now. This will be his 7th speech. The poor man, if he wasn't suffering enough, he's got to deal with the accusations of these people. And basically is saying, I've heard all you've said, but the wicked do prosper. Job claimed that the wicked and the righteous die for the same reason. They are sinners. They don't die early because they are wicked sinners. God does not punish the children of the wicked who die late in life for their parents' sins. Job said that would be no punishment on the parents, since they won't be alive to witness the children's suffering. He also pointed out that his companions were putting God in a box, were not allowing him to judge freely, but they required that God behave according to their theological ideas. They were, in fact, creating God in their own image. The truth about suffering is, we still don't know. The answer still eludes us. Even with our additional revelation, we wrestle over the apparent injustice and seeming cruelty of God's providence. We don't understand it. And very often people will say, they probably never will. When death comes, it obviously makes a great deal of difference in the next life, whether or not the individual had faith in Jesus Christ. That's where the difference lies. All these things come upon us in life. We can't point to a particular reason, or that God has done this, or God has done that, or this is what I did, and so now I'm suffering because of this. Because it doesn't match up with what we know our experiences are. The key is, are we ready for the next life? So as the second round closes, we find that Job is in the initiative. He's still wrestling with his problems, of course. His friends, however, are trying to salvage some part of their treasured theology from this savage to whom nothing is sacred. They just can't get the message across to him. It would have been best for them just to leave him alone, but they've one more attempt to make in trying to condemn and justify their own theology.